Welcome, everyone, to the June 22nd City Council work session. We have two items up. The first one is Parks and Recreation, and then at 12:55 we'll switch over to real property disposal procedures, which you all asked us to have part of a work session. So we'll start out with Parks and Recreation. City Manager?
Thank you, Mayor, very much, and I'm going to turn it over to Carolyn and her team.
Hi.
Hi. Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. Happy to be here. Want to also introduce, we have here some members of our team, including Craig Carnegie and Craig Smith from Recreation and Parks, and other members of our team that are working hard. We thought we would actually start today's work session with just a little brief nugget of history that is relevant to today. It was 50 years ago that the Eugene voters passed the largest bond measure for recreation services that this community has ever seen. So in 1966, a bond measure was passed that paid for the construction of Echo Hollow Pool, Sheldon Pool, Amazon Community Center, Westmoreland Community Center, and Sheldon Community Center. So 2 pools and 3 community centers. And I think that's just a good way to start today because it represents the importance of planning for the future and thinking about our facilities. And that's exactly what we're here to do today. So, the last time we were here was back in January. We had just completed our needs assessment report, and we talked to you about the findings of that report and all of the community outreach that we had done leading up to it. Today, we are back to tell you about some ideas we have in response to this needs assessment report and how we anticipate engaging the community in these ideas. And then we'll be back in the fall, and at that point we'll report back to you what we have learned over the summer through our process and to ask for some direction on where we should go with some of our implementation strategies. Today is just an update, but in the fall we'll be seeking some direction. So the goals of the Parks and Recreation System Plan, there's 3 of them: to address current problems that we have identified with the system, to plan for future population growth and trends that we see coming, and to create an exciting vision for the future that is something that is compelling to residents today and the current or future generations. So to refresh briefly about the problems that we have identified, the first is that current funding isn't sufficient to maintain our current park system, or importantly, to be able to grow that park system. Number 2 is that our community centers and pools are outdated and too small for current needs. As I mentioned, a lot of those recreation facilities were built about 50 years ago at a time when our population was less than half of what it is today. And so today we do the best we can to program for as many people as possible in some very small spaces, but it does limit what we can do. The third issue is that parks, pools, and community centers are not equally distributed throughout the community. We have an equity issue that needs to be addressed. And finally, that there are some safety concerns in some of our parks. Not all of them. Generally, the system is quite safe, but there are some areas that have been identified where by both our staff and we've heard from the community that they don't necessarily feel safe. And those areas are generally in some of the natural areas along our river and along Amazon Creek, in places where we do see a lot of illegal camping associated with that. So those are the problems. Things we see coming in the future that we need to be planning for are the fact that our population is growing, and along with that growing population, we will proportionately become older, so we will have more seniors in our population, as well as we'll be more culturally diverse, and particularly with our growing Latino community. Second, we see that people are experiencing health consequences of inactivity. We see an obesity epidemic both locally and nationally, and Parks and Recreation being a place where people can be active can be part of reversing that trend. We also know that families are facing economic challenges, and again, Parks and Recreation is a service that provides very important amenities to folks that can't afford to go to private providers to find it elsewhere. And finally, that we are seeing the impacts of climate change with our hottest summer on record last year, and we saw it in the amount of people coming to our pools and our parks and in the river. People see our services as a way to as a respite, I guess, from the heat, and we want to be able to plan for how our physical infrastructure can be resilient in the face of climate change. And then third is the goal of creating this vision. And so we have many, many places that we are thankful for today that past generations helped to create, from Amazon Pool to the Ridgeline Trail to the Willamette Riverfront Park System. And we want to build on that system, build on those strengths, and create a legacy for future generations to enjoy. So our process is comprised of 4 basic steps. The first is to identify what the community's principles are around Parks and Recreation. The second is to collectively build a common vision for what the future can look like. The third then is to understand what are the priorities of that vision. We can't make the vision happen all at once, so how do we put this together over time? And then fourth is to develop an implementation strategy that's really based on the previous 3 steps, so that this is not just a vision plan, but it's also an action plan. And the way that those steps lay out on our project timeline is we started with the collection phase, which was last year, and we did collect information from 7,000 individuals through a variety of techniques, and we learned what our strengths, what our challenges, and what those important principles are to guide us in our decision making. So those 4 principles that we identified from that outreach are to care for and make the most of what we have, so to be good stewards of the system we have today. Also to serve the entire community, so grow the system in order to serve those that are not currently being served. To create more connections, and this is about having a system that is physically connected through trails and paths where everybody can have easy access to these facilities. And fourth is to build better partnerships. So partnerships is something we do all the time, but we recognize, and the community has asked us to make sure that we are partnering, even developing deeper relationships and utilizing those limited resources with other agencies to the best of our abilities, and being really strategic about that. So those are the 4 principles that are kind of guiding us as we go forward. Over the last several months, we have been taking everything that we learned in that first collection phase and developing a set of ideas that comprise the vision. And I want to share some of these ideas with you. There are 17 of them, and they're organized by the principles, and I'll briefly go through these. But the first one is under the principle of caring for and making the most of what we have. Obviously, we want to be able to maintain our current system with adequate funding to do that. We also need to be able to renovate our community centers, our pools, our parks, and our natural areas that are in need of renovation. We have highlighted their revitalizing riverfront parks because we heard loud and clear from the community that one of the most important amenities to them is the river. And whereas we have great facilities for walking or biking along the river, it's difficult to get down to the river for things like swimming, for things like boating or fishing. And so really kind of looking at our current riverfront parks and seeing how we can re-energize those. Also looking at our downtown open spaces, obviously that's been an important discussion around this table, and we're pleased to see that moving forward because the downtown parks are such an important part of the system to the local economy, to making downtown livable, and to creating a really vibrant destination. And then finally, making parks safer. And so really looking at those problem areas that we have, looking at increased lighting, maybe some selective vegetation removal to increase visibility, and increasing our official presence in those areas through the Park Ambassador Program or Ranger Program or something of the like. So the next group of ideas is related to equity and serving the entire community. And this map gives us a good basis to talk about this from. So the blue areas are areas that do not currently have access to community centers or pools. And that's southwest in the Churchill area and in the north in Santa Clara. And so these are areas where we would one day like to be able to serve those neighborhoods with community centers and pools. The bright orange dots with the black background are park sites that have been acquired in neighborhoods that do not currently have access to neighborhood or community parks, but we've not been able to develop them, and that's in large part due to the lack of maintenance funding we have. There are 17 of those park sites that we have throughout the community, primarily in the north and the west, and they are both neighborhood and community park sites. We're also looking at equity around access to natural areas, and the north part of town has less access than south with the Ridgeline or west with the West Eugene wetlands. And we do believe that the Willamette River north of Beltline has great opportunity in the future to provide those larger natural areas and access for residents in the northern part of town. That is a long-range vision because much of that land is currently in use with sand and gravel, and so we believe it's important, though, to be talking to those property owners and keeping that kind of in the front of our mind as a long-term goal. And then finally, increasing inclusion for all cultures, ages, abilities, and incomes. This is a value we practice every day, but we want to keep improving and keep putting that out there in the forefront as well. The next set of ideas is around those physical connections and how to have a connected system. And the first item we talk about is expanding walking and biking opportunities in all neighborhoods. We have learned that walking and bicycling are the most common forms of recreation that people participate in. And so we can, in some essence, look at neighborhoods as a place to do that, and it doesn't have to be a park. So we have been talking with our coworkers in Public Works Transportation and thinking about not only making some of those, particularly the low-volume residential streets, not just transportation corridors, but recreation corridors as well, and then connecting them into a larger system of off-street paths and trails. And I think this map does a pretty good job of showing kind of the concept of what those off-street paths and trails can look like. This is just the diagram of the basics. There's many more than this. But this idea is that we already have a number of connected systems and paths and trails in place, particularly along the Ridgeline, along the river, and along Amazon Creek. And so by filling in those gaps and by adding new connections, such as pathways north of Beltline, this one leading over to the west, we call that the Farm Belt Loop, into the West Eugene wetlands, and then this one leading along the east side of the Willamette and meeting up with the Mackenzie River and connecting with trails that go up to Coburg, into Springfield, and down into the central city. So there's this kind of larger concept of a network that we think these can really improve access to everyone in the community to trails. The next set of ideas are around the principle of building better partnerships. And I would say that probably every project I've mentioned deals with partnerships. So we, just because of the nature of how we do things, but we wanted to highlight these 3 projects as specifically being oriented towards partnerships. The first one being collaborating with our school districts, in particular, on a community school model of service delivery. This is something many communities do. It makes the best use of schools that we can, where they become neighborhood hubs, not just for learning, but for recreation and for social services and public health, and really providing that kind of wraparound service. The second is building a multi-field sport complex. This idea is that we would have co-located a number of fields and potentially indoor gym space as well in one location. We definitely do in this community have a shortage of fields and gym space. Any of the providers will tell you that. And so it provides for additional field space and allows us to have tournaments. So locally based tournaments, regionally based tournaments. A lot of families leave town every weekend to have to drive to another place, another community, and we'd like to be able to keep those families here. So we are engaged currently in a feasibility study in partnership with Willamette Lane and Traveling County to look at what is the market feasibility for such a complex here in Eugene. And then the final idea is really just an acknowledgement of expanding our financial partnerships, and that we really must continue to be creative and diversify where we get our funding from, looking at sponsorships, looking at maintenance endowments, continuing to leverage our volunteer contributions, our donations, our grants, to really have a creative and a diverse kind of financial profile there. So that encompasses the 17 kind of broad ideas. I also want to mention that we are taking a finer grained look at the system. So the entire city is divided into these 6 different sub-planning areas. For each one of these areas, we are developing a report that provides a detailed inventory of all of the existing resources and facilities, identifies the gaps and the issues and needs in that area, and then also looks at how those 17 broader vision ideas apply to that particular area. So this is where a resident who's interested in a specific park down the street from their house can go and get more detailed about that particular resource. So that's what we've been working on for the last several months, and we're really excited to be at this phase where we are bringing this back out to the community to ask them what we've missed and what are their priorities. We have a number of different techniques for engaging the community. The first is we are using the Picture Your Parks newsletter, which is an annual newsletter that goes out from the Parks and Open Space Division to all city households. So we're kind of taking that over with the system plan and with some of these ideas and mailing that. It should arrive in people's homes next week. So that's a great communication tool. In coordination with that, then we have an online survey that people can go to and tell us what they think. We'll be doing a statistically valid survey this fall that will focus more on kind of understanding what the financial support for parks is in the community. That's an important aspect to understand. We'll be taking our little red Volkswagen-inspired trailer out on the road again. We have dates in all parts of town, and we will actually be inviting each of you to attend. So keep an eye out for that invitation. And in particular, we'd like you to help give out ice cream. It's the best job there is. You are very popular when you're the one holding the ice cream.
One for you.
Yep. We will have a speakers bureau, so any neighborhood association or organization that will invite us, we will go talk to them. We will continue with our stakeholder meetings, talking to our agency partners and our user groups, and of course we have our website and e-newsletter as well. So based on that feedback that we get over the summer, we'll be refining our vision and developing an implementation strategy. And then in the spring of next year, early next year, we look forward to coming back here for adoption of that plan. And so the next time that we see you at this table here will be in the fall, and we'll have the results of our community engagement that we'll share with you, and then we'll also be asking you for direction on kind of where to head with our vision and plan. So that's it. I think I'll invite Craig and Craig to join me, if you would, and happy to answer any questions you have.
Comments before questions? I have Mike and Greg in the queue, and Chris. Okay, Mike?
Well done. Thank you. And thank you, Mayor. A couple of questions. Number one, and I appreciate your coming back and kind of following up and keeping us plugged in with this all along the way of what seems like a larger effort to address an awful lot of things. Number one, can you give any reliable estimate of what we will see as far as if a lot of this planning takes place, or I mean a lot of this work takes place for a Santa Clara community park? I know we're still waiting on the one parcel. I know it's bound in some issues, so can you project for us at all?
Well, our plans for Santa Clara Community Park are to continue with acquisition. So we would like to continue to build on what we currently have and make a larger, more contiguous property.
Right, but I know that there's one still to get. Do you know when we can get it?
I don't know about that. I'm not that familiar with those discussions.
The property itself?
Yeah.
We're hard working on that every day. Basically, we're trying to keep in contact with as many adjacent property owners as we can to get updates on their willingness to sell, and we're willing to certainly put that compilation of property together as soon as we can.
My understanding is that there is still money that remains from the 06 bond and or the 98 bond that allows for the acquisition of that when you have a willing seller. Am I right?
Correct.
Okay. So the problem we have is not a willing seller in that particular. Is there more than one parcel? I thought there was just one left to complete that.
There's a couple of different options that we're looking at to complete that. So there's more than one property owner, but yeah.
Okay. You mentioned multi-field opportunities in indoor gym. I was given a presentation. I want to say it's been about a year and a half, maybe even 2 ago. I think some other counselors were as well, about the idea for, I don't know how to describe it, not a junior level, an amateur level track facility. Is that a part, and there were architectural drawings for it and a lot of conversation around how particularly high schools and that sort of thing don't have the capacity for a larger meet and often end up having to travel to other cities in order to do that. And that seems odd in Tracktown, USA. So is that a part of your planning, what I'm referencing?
We're actually engaged in discussions with the community up in the Sheldon area right now to see about the potential to improve the track and field concept.
Excellent.
There.
Excellent. And with the school district?
Yes.
On that,
Yes.
for that location?
Yep.
All right. Lastly, I would say this is just kind of my general impression that there are a number of things on the list of those that need doing that you've shown. Some of them rank differently in priority than others. And I wonder if you have any kind of internal work that lets you say, if we can't get to everything all at once, if we can't do a grand bond at some future point, how will we deal with the priority scale? For example, maintenance is a much bigger issue than several of the other things mentioned, or safety and on the riverfront. Can you address that issue of prioritization at all, without, if you don't get the one grand bite at it?
Well, we are anticipating that this vision would need to be completed in phases. It is probably too big of a bite to do all in one. And so one of the most important pieces that we're engaging the community in this summer is to help us understand what the community's priorities are. And so that is what the survey is basically all about, is trying to suss out of all these ideas what is most important to you. And then, of course, we need to look at where opportunities exist with our partners. So is there an opportunity to partner with somebody over here that can leverage dollars to make something happen? So we're going to be, at the end of this summer engagement, kind of trying to meld all those together and come back to you and see if we have our priorities right.
And I'll just add that I think from what we've heard, both in our discussions internally with staff as well as from the community, I mean, sustainable funding for park maintenance is a linchpin for us to expand the system in order to give equitable access to parks throughout the north and the west. So I think our priorities would certainly be, let's get the O&M piece solved. That allows us to use some of our capital dollars to go up into the north, into the west, to put neighborhood parks up there. And then again, we've heard from the community priorities around trails, connectivities, riverfront, and then rec facilities. So, but the first two priorities would really be O&M and then neighborhood parks that have not been developed for over a decade now. So,
Thank you very much. That's very helpful.
Ray?
Thanks, Mayor. Again, I echo the same sentiments as Councilor Clark. I appreciate the update. There's a couple of things here that, jump out at me. Over the last, few weeks and months, or actually last few years, I've been attending, girls softball. My daughter's involved in that, in the tournament deal. Same thing with soccer. And it seems to me that other places like Salem, Grants Pass, Newburgh have, even Junction City's facility is not in the same category as some of these other facilities, but they do have a facility, and we don't have those facilities. And so are we in danger of being in some kind of Title IX issues with regard to the inequitable capacity we have, boys and men versus girls and women facilities, both on the outdoor as well as in the indoor?
Yeah, I'm not sure
realm?
how. We haven't addressed that specifically as far as how that's related to universities and schools and Title IX access, but our access historically within this community has been pretty broad in the sense that we're very aligned with the schools, or we're sharing facilities with the schools. So the gap we show is that we simply don't have a complex like other communities have been building over the last decade or so. But to say that there's a difference between serving men and women, boys and girls, then no, we don't have a measurement for that.
I note that, in Bethel, we have Bethel Park, which is for baseball, and we don't have facilities for softball. We don't have facilities per se for volleyball. I know that Willamette Lane provides that on 32nd as part of their multi-purpose facility over there, but in Eugene, we don't have that capacity.
Yeah, we're definitely aware we need more diamonds as far as to compensate for the lack of softball and Little League baseball spaces. So we don't have a complex like Shasta anywhere else. That's 4 fields, but we do have 2 fields at Amazon that are softball, and then we work with Kids Sports on the 2 fields at Washington Park for softball and Little League as well. But they don't stick out as a complex where you can really be efficient in how you run teams and leagues and tournaments.
And as we kind of move forward with this in terms of development in the north end in Bethel and in Churchill, can you elaborate a little bit more in terms of issues around the development of specific community center sites? Because I've had some other folks in the community approach me, particularly out in Councilor Pryor's area about the lack of, community center kinds of facilities such as what you have in Sheldon or in South Eugene, or even in Bethel, to the degree that we have those kinds of facilities such as Echo Hollow Pool, which is not exactly up to A rating at the moment.
It's not up to A rating, but it's probably one of our heaviest used year-round pools because of its capacity and how it serves that area, in the sense that it doesn't just serve this Willamette High School in Bethel. It serves, we get Junction City and Marist coming in for that pool. So I just think it's real evident that we lack a community center and pool in Churchill, and it's real evident we lack one in Santa Clara. And how much of a priority for that is that going to be? I guess we need to wait and see. We definitely know it's been an issue. It's been an issue for 40 years. And the same thing with Bethel. We know that Echo Hollow Pool is old and small, and if we need to do something, we need to remodel it to make it larger and more usable for a variety of programming. And the same with Peterson Barn. We got it in 1975, and it's literally a dairy barn that we've converted. And so if we do it in Bethel, we need to look at remodeling that facility to see if it can expand to again, do more programming. At the same time, we're still talking partnerships with folks, and we're having great conversations with stakeholders, and Bethel is very open to looking at a complex at Echo Hollow Pool and Cascade Middle School to see if there's something we can do together to really serve the community better there in the community school concept, which is a shared value. So.
Thank you. And I agree. That's a very important conversation to have. I am very impressed with the work you've done, and I like the kind of logic you followed to get to where you are. And your process, I think, is a good one in terms of making sure you follow those steps. And so understanding community priorities and level of commitment that you had under the process, I think, is a really key element to it. And you've already collected some information. You've translated that into a set of principles, which I agree with 100%. One of which is serve the entire community. So it gets back to just what we were talking about before. But you're now beginning to work on translating those principles into a series of ideas. And I think these ideas look great, and I think they're wonderful. And so the one thing that I would add, though, is now as you go forward to try to measure what the priorities are, what the ideas are, how to go forward with them, how to fund them, so forth. The element that I think will be critical is to try to figure out what is that level of commitment to the ideas. Because as we have learned, people will be interested in all of these ideas. And so if you just go out and you say, do you like these ideas, you're going to get, hey, these are all great, I love them. And that can give you the false sense that they love all these ideas, let's go. So you need to figure out in the outreach that you're going to be doing now, in the engagement you're going to be doing now, to get a good sense that you can bring back to us is what is the level of commitment that this community will have to any one of these ideas. And by that I mean, what are they willing to pay? What are they willing to commit to do? Because they'll like the ideas, but that doesn't translate through to their commitment. So I guess the encouragement is figure out a way in your engagement process to find the level of actual commitment that people will have to these ideas so that we can determine, that will help us determine the priority order. But it will also help us to determine how we will fund and how we will implement these. Because some of these may have a high level of commitment for bond measures or funding mechanisms like that, but others won't, and we'll have to find other ways to make them happen or make them a reality. So I guess that would be the one thing I would encourage. You've done such incredible work up to this point, but I don't want us to fall down by not having followed through and determine what the public will really stand behind and help us. And that's the word to emphasize, help us to make this all happen. That's the piece that we need to measure, because I want to see this take place. I want to see us to get there, but I want it to do it in a way that's realistic and that we can kind of depend on and not be surprised later on.
You're absolutely right, and I think that's where the statistically valid survey comes in that we'll be doing later in the fall, where we can really kind of measure that level of commitment. And we'll be doing a 400-person telephone survey probably to understand that better.
Yeah, it's the way you ask the questions.
Yeah.
Boy, howdy.
So yesterday, I was at a meeting with Bev Smith, and there was a lot of conversation about what's happening to our kids, about the parts of their body they don't know how to use anymore because they don't ever get a chance to use it. That kind of knowing how your body works, getting a kind of, because we don't in many schools have our PE programs, and kids are, a lot of conversation about kids not having a lot of free time to explore themselves and all of that too. So I just wanted to put out there the thought of that free play is a really important part of kids being able to get savvy about their bodies and figure out how to move in this world and be successful. They had, I understand that our ROTC program had to change their requirements for their participants because they didn't know how to do things with their bodies that kids used to know how to do. And so I just think there is a kind of a physical literacy that we should be talking about as we look at our recreation and our parks programs. And part of that is how do we make it feel safe for people to let their kids go play. And I think that's a really important question that Eugene should be able to answer.
Yeah.
Agree. Yes. I don't know if there's no answer to that except for yes. We're in conversation with Bev Smith as well, and her influence, I think, on the community and how she's reshaping kids sports. We're very aligned with that, with involving the schools as well. We've had a history of our after-school programs, the grants we receive for that, creating physical literacy for youth based on the programming we do. We actually have summer camps in which there is definitely some what we call unstructured time in this space.
It's important for you to think about this as you do this planning and as you talk to the folks who are part of the planning about how do we work with our partners all over the place to try to encourage that physical literacy.
Right, and Richard Louv, who wrote Last Child in the Woods, has been a proponent of that for the last 8 to 10 years as far as that goes, and that's saturated into our staff thinking and programming as well.
The other question I had was, I know the civic people are really engaged in that facility and working on it, so I'm assuming that we're building that into our partnership kind of conversation to make more playing fields and other kinds of things available for people in our community.
Correct. It's a systems plan, and so part of that is looking at what all the other partners are doing to help the community with its system, and so we're accounting for those. Like we've spoken with Bev about if they do build a field house, it's 4 to 6 courts, and part of their business plan model is to do adult sports in that as well, then that affects us, and so we need to be on the same page with them on what we're offering to help fill gaps in the community and
how we can kind of leverage each other, so to
be
speak.
part of that. Great. To work together instead of independently on what their plan is and their business model with that plan. It's both facilities and then what they're doing with those facilities, how they're maintaining those facilities, and how that affects the whole system.
One other thing I wanted to bring up is that as we've had a reduction in school-age kids in our community, schools have closed, and schools have those facilities that you're talking about. So, for instance, kids in the Whitaker neighborhood have to get all the way over to River Road to their schools. They don't have a nearby place, but the old Whitaker school is still there. It belongs to Head Start now. So I'm just encouraging you to look at those kinds of things, either prior schools that are now owned by nonprofits or have some other usage that you may be able to have those kind of partnerships to make it so that more children, especially in children that don't have easy access and they can't get to the school they attend easily to do things, that there may be some innovative things around that about how you can use those old facilities to partner with them to make something more available close by that kids can get to without having to be taken there, so to speak. So I just wanted to bring that up. Thanks. And okay, and I've got Mike and then Greg.
Thank you, Mayor. You just said something that made me think. During all of our conversations around Civic Stadium and purchasing that and selling that, as it were, there were an awful lot of folks that I had contact with who their biggest concern with our becoming involved in purchasing that was that at some point in the future, the concern went, that they wouldn't succeed at their private fundraising, and that at some point they'd turn around and ask the city to join some part of a bond campaign in order to be able to fund either the construction or some manner of taking care of what happens at that particular private location. So I guess I'm asking right now, are any of your conversations around including what they're doing in any manner of potential bond of the future with the city?
No, not at this point.
No, not in those conversations.
Okay.
One of the
I
conversations.
mean, I'm going to get asked that question. That's why I had a whole bunch of folks predicting the future, telling me that this was going to happen. So I want to ask right at the horse's mouth. Forgive me, but I want to ask.
They're fundraising, and I think our question to them, as we met with Kids Sports and the Y, was you're both having capital campaigns paralleling each other. So how is that, you think, affecting the communities and whatnot? So that's even part of the conversation, not just with them, but with what the Y is trying to do in our.
But that won't be something we plan to
Haven't discussed
have
that.
as a part of it. Okay.
No.
All right. Thank you.
I did want to add, though, I think we did in that conversation talk about perhaps at some future date when they finish building and doing what they're doing, that we might program some of that space at some point as to the mutual benefit of everybody.
The civic space? The civic space?
Yeah.
Right, especially that field house.
Right.
I mean, the target to put an elite soccer field in there is great for one element. It's not necessarily the element that recreation serves, but it's a community element that would be nice. We actually need a complex, more spaces for our youth to play. But that field house is definitely a benefit to the community in a large way.
Great.
Thanks, Mayor. And I don't want to throw a damper on this, but one of the things we bring up in this conversation is safety. And I will note that, Mayor, when you talk about unstructured play, I think all of us of a certain age grew up where you could go out the house in the summer, go to the playground, spend the whole day out there, and then you come home and nobody bothered you. And unfortunately, I have had to tell my daughter several times, who is now going into middle school, who wants to ride her bike home, that no, you cannot ride your bike home because we are not comfortable with the level of safety in our community that somebody won't come up and snatch you. I mean, in the last couple of days, we've had reports in our neighborhood of, men that are following girls around on bikes or walking down the street or whatever. And so, we talk about safety in parks. I've heard a lot of people have said to us, even coming in one of our mayor listening sessions at Albertsons, how people are afraid to even go to the park across the street from where they live because of safety issues and concerns. So it's not, a thing that I'm just throwing this blast on you. I mean, as part of the whole, issue of safety that includes our police department, our park system, and how we can, provide more safer spaces and be able to, I don't suggest that, anybody in this day and age send their children out unsupervised, but there has to be at some point where we can have a level of comfort and safety that, we can go into a park and not be harassed or not be afraid to allow your child to go and do their thing and think that you're going to turn your head and boom, your child is going to be gone, or something is going to happen, or somebody's going to accost you, or whatever the case may be. I don't know if there's even any kind of real perfect solution to this, but at some point we need to figure out some kind of way of dealing with the public safety issues that are brought up by people trying to use parks for their intended usage and not for other uses that are either nefarious or illegal.
If I may, I just want to mention that when I was talking about park operations and maintenance as being a top priority, I include park safety and security within that spectrum of work. It's something that our staff deals with every single day, that we hear from our park patrons about every single day. We've come up with programs like our Park Ambassadors program and our Park Watch program, and we're partnering more and more with EPD to try to have a more positive presence in our parks and encourage positive uses. It is a challenge, but it's part of our routine now of addressing our needs in our parks. Park safety, park security, top priorities, and I appreciate you bringing that up.
Thank you all very much. We're going to transition to our next item, but we very much appreciate the presentation. Look forward to the next one. Thank you very much.
That's for Orlando.
Oh, good. Next up is the work session on property disposal procedures. City Manager.
Thank you, Mayor. And as you mentioned, this got brought up a few months ago, and then there was a work session poll that was put out about this, and so this is coming back for this discussion. And I'll turn over to Denny and Glenn, actually, to get us going.
Thank you. So Denny and I are going to tag team this. I'm going to spend a couple minutes just reviewing what the processes are for real property disposal that are in the code. Denny will spend several minutes talking about some of the property that the city has sold and the process those went through, and then there should be lots of time for you to have either ask questions or have a conversation about how you want to do things differently. The AIS describes basically the four processes that the code contains for disposing of property. And when I say property, I mean real property. There are other code sections that relate to personal property. So if we're selling, surplus cars or something like that, different process than what we're talking about here. The first process is one where the property is covered by a development plan. And a development plan could be something like the airport master plan. So it may be in that plan it says, this is what the area looks like, and here's some property that we're actually intending to be used for commercial purposes. So it would have been a council-adopted plan, so the council would have basically given direction that at some point in the future, that property should be disposed of for particular purposes. If we're under that provision of the code, and I'm not sure if Denny has an example of that or not, I don't recall us using that particular part of the code very much, if at all. But there are two different ways to do it. One is what would be a public disposal process. So we have a piece of property that's covered by that development plan. We would give public notice that we're intending to dispose of it. Here are the kinds of terms that we're talking about. People could then say, I'm interested. Alternatively, there could be a private negotiation for a particular piece of property. Under that scenario, the city manager would have to come to the council and say, we've negotiated this. Here's the particulars. Are you interested in moving forward? Second process is the declaration of surplus property. Under this scenario, the city manager has a piece of property, says we don't need that anymore, would do a public declaration that the property is surplus. Council would have a certain amount of time to review that and decide basically whether you agree with it or not. If you decide you want to review it, then you would decide whether to move forward with the surplus disposal. If you didn't want to review it, then we could go through, accept bids, and then depending on the amount of the sale, if it's over $100,000, that would come back to the council. If it was less than $100,000 and somebody provided a bid that was consistent with that public notice of the declaration of surplus, then the manager could accept that. The third way in which we dispose of property, this section of the code deals with where we dispose to a governmental entity. Here, the city council, basically you get to decide on an ad hoc basis, here's the process that you want to go through. hypothetically, Lane County says it's interested in a piece of property that we own. The manager could bring that to you. One of you could just raise it. You would decide at that point, do you accept whatever offer Lane County has made? Do you want to do an RFP? Do you want to do public notice? Do you want to do a public hearing? The authority is entirely yours to dictate for that particular piece of property, here's the process that you want to go through. The fourth process is, I just call it sort of the catch-all, and that's where somebody has come to the city manager and said, I'm interested in this particular piece of property. The manager says, seems like a pretty good deal to the city. The manager then comes to you and says, have this individual or this business that's interested in purchasing this piece of property, are you interested in selling it? And assuming that you're interested in selling it, you can then say, yes, we're interested in selling it. Here's the process that we want you to go through. It could be as simple as we accept, meaning the council accepts, whatever offer that individual or business made. It could be, manager, we're interested in selling it. Why don't you go out, put a for sale sign on the piece of property. Let's see what kind of interest we get. Or do a full-blown RFP. But again, for that one, it's the manager comes to the council, but then the council gets to say, here's the process that you would want to follow. That's the one that's probably used more typically where somebody has said, I'm interested in this piece of property. Manager comes to the council, and then you decide what specifics the manager should go through before you agree to accept or reject it. And then Denny's going to talk about some examples.
Yeah, and so we looked at several property transactions that I think date back to really the late 90s. And if you think about that's around the time of Broadway Place when we were selling the old library. And there's been about 14 plus property transactions really just in the downtown core. So we kind of focused in on some of those just to start with. And if you look at the process that we use for each one of these transactions, I think we've actually utilized all of the variations that Glenn has just outlined. But despite really the variation in the process, I think the goal has always been to provide a positive outcome that's really consistent with the downtown plan goals, the urban renewal plan goals. So we're always working within that framework regardless of the methodology. And in a lot of cases, those don't involve necessarily the highest price. We have other objectives as far as what we want to accomplish at downtown in our downtown plan. In some cases, we've positively identified a piece of property as a development site, a site that's within a downtown plan area or the urban renewal plan area, and we've issued an RFP or an RFQ and actually established criteria as to what we want to see on those sites. Some examples of properties that occurred or projects that occurred through an RFP or RFQ process were the Broadway Place apartments, the Tate condominiums, the old library was sold via an RFP, the Westtown on 8th Affordable Housing Project, which was a land bank site, and the Broadway Commerce Center. Those were all kind of RFP processes where we proactively develop criteria for those. In other cases, as Glenn mentioned, we responded to interest that's being expressed in a piece of property that either the city or the Urban Renewal Agency owns. It's not being marketed, but there's interest in the site, and the Northwest Community Credit Union was actually considered to be a development site, but at the time we weren't actively marketing it. That interest really came to us. The shed, the property, most recently the property behind the Rogue Brewery that you approved the disposition of is another example of someone coming to us. In some cases, we've conveyed property to other government entities, the federal courthouse property, the Lane Community College Downtown Center, most recently the U of O, the old Bradford's building that was conveyed to the University for the Rain Innovation Hub. In other instances, we've gone through the more formal declaration of surplus process. 858 Pearl, which was the old City Hall 2 that was conveyed for the Park Place Apartments, actually went through the formal notice and declaration of surplus process. We've also taken a more traditional path and just pounded a for sale sign and engaged a broker in properties, and that would typically be in maybe outlying areas. 901 Franklin, that was the approach that we used. We actually engaged a broker and put a for sale sign on that property. on the edge out in West Eugene, the Willow Creek, which was a land bank site that didn't get developed that we were required to sell. Again, we just put a for sale sign on it. Again, when you look at all of these, there really hasn't been a one-size-fits-all kind of approach. In fact, we've even traded property in some cases. We traded Diamond parking lot where LCC Downtown Center sits with a parking lot we owned at 12th and Oak. So we've done a lot of different things, different approaches. Each property is kind of unique. Each situation is unique. Some properties are maybe more important than others because of their location. The Beam Building, is the Broadway Commerce Center, is a really good example. Very important corner. Some have been sold at market value, some have been sold below market value, some have been sold for $1. It just varies depending on what our goal and objectives are. I think having some flexibility within the different options that we have to sell property has been very important, I think, in achieving some of our goals downtown. And I think if you look at all of these, most of these, we've had great success regardless of the methodology that we've chosen. And finally, as Glenn mentioned, I think in all cases, again, council has had the opportunity to engage in that transaction, determine whether or not this was the right method to dispose, and ultimately the council has approved, or the Urban Renewal Agency has approved, all of these property transactions, so you have the opportunity to engage with those in every case. So,
Questions? I've got Betty, and then Mike, and then George rolling. Betty?
Thank you. So when does a property become surplus? It's pretty obvious to me that the old library, once we had the new library, that was surplus. But a parking lot across the street from the former city hall, how did that become surplus?
The parking, well, if there is a parking lot right now that the city owns that's across from the new city hall site, and then there's the property that was sold to the shed, which is the other quarter block. The parking lot that we still own is not declared surplus. It's a.
So I'm talking about the one that was sold to the shed.
The shed was actually not a formal surplus declaration. That was a property owner, adjacent property owner, the shed, who came to us and with interest in purchasing the property, and that offer was brought to the city council via the city manager.
But we didn't do a RFP.
That's correct.
The community, the credit union, that was brought to us a few days before it was sold, right?
It was brought to us before we actively marketed it. I think if we would have, our intent was to do an RFP for that site. It's a very important site as part of our reconnection to the river. So I think we were on a path eventually to do an RFP for that site, but the credit union came to us before we initiated that process, so we brought it to council.
I'm concerned about those things that happen in such a hurry, but I'm more concerned about the Kesey Square thing than anything that's come up that I know about. It seems to me that if any property is going to be sold, council should know about it before the negotiations start. And could we, I think that we should discuss how to achieve that, how to achieve a requirement that council and the public know before any negotiations. I've heard from people who I think are reliable that negotiations for Kesey Square were going on for a few years before council heard that anyone was talking about selling it. Can you explain that or elaborate on that? Or can someone tell me how we could have established a requirement that council knows before any negotiations?
My understanding, and I don't always know immediately, as in the day
You
it happens,
know everything.
but I try, is that negotiations over Kesey Square had not been going on for years. I'm not sure how long they had been going on before council knew something about it. In terms of what the council could do, you can change the code. I mean, adopt an ordinance that would say, here's a different process that the council wants to be followed. Right now, there are several different processes in the code. They all involve, ultimately, the council at some point saying the council is willing to have property transferred from public ownership to some other ownership.
But after it's almost happened.
Well, it depends on what you mean by almost happened, because, like I say, ultimately the council has to pass a motion that says, okay to sell that property, or depending on if it's a declaration of surplus and the council doesn't say you're interested in actually reviewing it, then going through a public bid process, the manager could dispose of it. But again, the council would have been notified under that scenario, and you could have said you are interested in reviewing it. The time that you would have a negotiation that could happen before the council could know about it, that's that fourth catch-all category that I talked about, where if somebody brings something to the manager and the manager says, yeah, I think that may make some sense, then the manager still has to bring that to the council. At that point, the council can say, we're not interested in selling it, or we're not sure whether we're interested in selling it. We want a public hearing. We want an RFP. You get to decide what it is. So the only way that something would get sold soon after the council was notified of it is if the council made the decision that no additional process was necessary. But the control is entirely in your hands, you being the council as a whole.
But the public would not know about it.
That would be up to the council.
Such as, well, I know that I've been told by, I think, reliable people that people who wanted to put a building on Kesey Square thought they had a deal already before we were asked. But
So my answer, Betty, legally is if they thought they had a deal, then they should have checked with their lawyer, because their lawyer could have told them that the city manager lacks the legal authority to sell property. Only the council can make a decision to sell the property. So until the council says, we agree that the property's sold.
Yeah, I understand that would be the final thing, but people... So if we wanted to make it more difficult for things to happen before the public knows, should I request a work session about that, or how could we do it?
The council today could give direction to the city manager to bring back and schedule for a public hearing an ordinance that does X. I'd need you to tell me what those additional requirements are so I could actually draft the ordinance. But no, I think that's my understanding of the purpose of this work session, is for you to have a conversation about whether you want to make changes, and once you tell me what those changes are, I can tell you, okay, that should go into the ordinance. It could be, if all you wanted to do was to say, prior to any disposal of real property, you want there to be some kind of public notice and a public hearing, you could do that by motion. Tell John that's what you want. Now, legally, he wouldn't have to do that, but of course, if he doesn't do what you say, you can always fire him. If you want to make it legally binding, you put it in the ordinance.
Okay. Can you make a motion? Can you craft a motion like that for me?
Well, I can, but I need you to tell me what the additional requirements...
What I want is, before any discussion of public property with a possible buyer, as soon as it comes, I want the council to be notified and have an opportunity to request a public hearing.
So just to make sure I understand what it is you would be asking for, the way I would interpret that is if somebody called up Denny to say, hey, Denny, have we sold
or John
Franklin?
Yes.
We're interested in buying the other parking lot adjacent to the shed across the street from the City Hall site. Can you tell me any information about that? Denny's response would need to be, not until I have talked to the council and the council has decided whether staff
whether it's for sale or not. Yes.
Right. And so if that's what you want, if you want staff to simply say, if anybody says, hey, I may be interested in this piece of property, staff to say, well, the first step in us being able to talk to you is going to the city council and having the city council say, you're interested in staff talking to the person. Yes, I could
Yes, that's what I would like.
Okay. Let me think about exactly how to say that, but perhaps if you keep having your discussion, and then I can get you that motion.
Thank you.
Mike, you're up.
Thank you, Mayor. I asked for this to be polled because I wanted to solve a problem of appearance. The problem that at some point in the future, any particular deal like this ends up looking like a sweetheart deal because of the lack of information or notice to the public. But at the same time, there's some principles I think maybe that we should be discussing in order to, before we get to any specific motions about what to do. Number one, I don't particularly want to throw cold water on those people who come up with creative, wonderful ideas for how to make our community better. I don't want to squelch creative thinking about how to use what may be currently a public space in a better way for everybody. So those who develop those kind of ideas and bring them to the manager and staff do so sometimes with a conflicting value of the secrecy of it. They want to be able to do that, but we have a conflicting value as servants of the public to be as transparent as we can. So the piece that Betty mentioned makes some sense to me, that we'd want to be able to say, you know, at some place along the way, I don't know if it's whether it's the first time someone approaches you, because then everyone knows, and that'll probably pretty much end anyone coming to you to ever ask if anyone with an idea. That'll end it pretty quick. So instead, there might be a different place, closer to the beginning, is my point, of a process of creatively, imagining what some space might be, where the council might have public access to that knowledge, and everybody should know, and we should have some discussion about whether it becomes surplus or how the process moves forward. I'm not sure what those are at this moment. That's kind of why I asked for the conversation. I thought maybe the group of us would talk about those principles involved. I think if we had a process for, how to make some more concrete statement from the council that yes, we'd be willing to hear a proposal on that. And no one could say there's a sweetheart deal. No one could say they're surprised. Everybody has access. And at the same time, I think that might have helped something like the eWeb deal too, for example, because one of the pieces was always, well, that property's not for sale. Nobody said it is. Yes, it could be. No, it's not. So I don't have the thing today on the top of my head yet. I don't want to do what Betty just mentioned because I think that kills everything. But maybe there's something that staff could imagine was a different step in that process where we'd know sooner, or the public would know sooner. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, John, too.
So, while John's thinking about how he might respond, one thing that doesn't get you as far as what I just heard you say, Mike, but gets you closer, and certainly make sure that nothing happens immediate and nothing happens without the opportunity for public involvement, is the council could put into the code that no property may be sold without a public hearing. So if there's going to be a public hearing, first the manager would have to come to the council and say, okay, we have a proposal from somebody. Council, are you interested in enough to schedule a public hearing? Then the public hearing would have to happen so the public would know about it, would have an opportunity to comment. That doesn't guarantee that you know about it within 2 minutes or 2 days or 2 weeks of when somebody first contacts city staff, but it does guarantee that the public, that the council and the public know about it with weeks of time to comment, or as much time as you say, because there's nothing that would require you to say, yeah, let's have a public hearing and have it tomorrow. You could say, let's have a public hearing and have it in 30 days or have it in 60 days or whatever time the council dictates. So that would be one way to get you part of the way there.
I've run out of time here, too. Were you going to answer, Manager, or no?
Yeah, I think about it.
Put you in the second round.
Yeah, I'd like to have more of a conversation, but I've run out of time.
George Pauling?
2 real quick questions and a comment. One, Does the property have to be designated as surplus prior to any discussions?
No.
And then in the AIS on page 8, it says in the second process, the city manager may privately solicit and negotiate proposals. That also means if someone comes up and initiates the conversation with the city manager or with staff, that's basically the same when you're talking about privately solicit. Either the city manager can say, Glenn, are you interested in buying this? Or you can come to the city manager and say, I'm interested in buying that.
Yes, but that first process that you're talking about, George, that's where something is covered by a development plan where the council has already said this property, in a sense, the council has said, not using the word surplus, but has said this property is designed for commercial private development.
Okay, but then in the fourth section, though, that basically covers the scenario where somebody comes up and approaches the city saying, I'm interested in buying this property.
Yes.
Okay. All right. I think what Betty is proposing is not a really good idea because there is a certain amount of confidentiality that developers would like to see when they start a process. And for them simply to go to Denny or to John and say, hey, I've got this piece of property that I've identified, let's talk about, is it for sale, is not doing any harm to anybody. And the way the code is written right now, I believe there's enough safeguards built in at any time prior to the sale being completed. We, the city council, have the right to say, stop right there. Let's not proceed any further with this sale. And at that point, we can say, let's take this out to a public hearing, or no, we don't want to sell it, or, let's, discontinue those negotiations and put it out to an RFP. My understanding on this is it's pretty much the council's decision at the point that a sale is coming to us for approval. We can do just about anything we want with it. Is that
correct?
So I think putting such a restriction and limitation that Betty is proposing is, to me, it's just bad business and a very dangerous direction to go if we're looking at developing or redeveloping any of our downtown properties.
Chris?
Thank you. I think the thing I'm hearing, the common interest that we all have is greater clarity around how these kinds of transactions occur. And it's perhaps that would be helpful for both the public, who this can be very complicated, they might not understand all the ins and outs, as well as us. Because obviously there are situations where how things happen and when they happen are confusing. I don't think there's any question that we're doing things illegally or unethically. It's just I don't know when things are happening, and I want to know at some point better when they're happening. And what constitutes what kind of thing that's happening. And I think there's a point at which a question is asked. I'm interested in this property, or I want to know more. It's a question. It's an approach. And then there's a conversation. Well, tell me about this property, or tell me about this, or what's going on here, or whatever. It's really a conversation at this point. And then there's an actual negotiation. I'm offering you this money. What might the terms and conditions be? And I think it's appropriate if you reach the point where you start talking about terms and conditions, that it would be appropriate for the council to be aware. Now, if the council has already previously authorized that you negotiate on a piece of property, I don't need to talk about it again. So the riverfront's a good example. All of the individual parcels in there, I don't need to have a conversation giving you permission, because you've been given permission to negotiate. But some other piece of property, let's say it's not been declared surplus, or it's just a piece of property that we own, and somebody comes and says, I'm interested in buying that. That's a question. Tell me a little bit about it. That's a conversation. What could I buy it for, and what would the condition? That's a negotiation. And at that point, I think we go into executive session and we talk about it. And I would hope that in general, that's the system we've already been using, but I don't think it's been real clear that that's the system we're using. And so what I want to say is I'm not nervous about having a conversation about a piece of property, but what you have to do is be very clear with us so we know that you understand there's a significant difference between a conversation about a piece of property and a negotiation. Because I think appropriately so, we're very nervous that we don't want any negotiations to occur around a piece of property that we don't know about. And I'm not saying that that has happened, but I'm saying we're not clear on when or where that line occurs. And so some clarity of what constitutes just a conversation about a piece of property and what constitutes actual negotiation. And I think Kesey Square is a perfect example of this. I don't have the impression that we were actually negotiating the sale of the property. I may be wrong, and it would be helpful to know, but that we were still in kind of the conversational phase. They put together all sorts of plans, not at our request, but at theirs. But we were not actually negotiating a sale of that property. And so I would look for clarity on that.
I guess I would just like to add in this conversation about the Kesey issue is that it was very common knowledge that there were some interest and concern about activities on Kesey Plaza, and that certain folks that have businesses in the area were trying to think about some possible solutions. And during their time of trying to think of some possible solutions, from time to time they talked to some counselors, they talked to me, and just to say, here's some things we're thinking about. And just like we do with the green property or anything else, we listen to that and we think about it as individuals, not as a body. And until at least this is what I think. I think until we set up the executive session to ask if council was interested in pursuing it, we didn't have a proposal on the table at all. And I don't perceive that there was any negotiations going on. And when they actually sent something to us, it was saying, this is what we're thinking about, and we want you to consider it, city. It was brought to executive session, and the question was asked of council, do you want us to pursue this or not? The outcome was, yes, we do. And so that is what transpired. I think maybe the thing you could correct there, and you just have to think about the right way to do it, is if our executive session says keep your mouth shut about what you've been talking about in your executive session until you're ready to make a decision of some kind. And the only thing I can think is we probably should have had taken it to the open, and I don't remember that. Maybe you do, Glenn. An open session and had a motion that we wanted to talk about it or not, or was it
I don't remember.
It's an issue that we have sometimes where nobody objects, and so we move on something. But so that's a part that I think you could do. We could be more transparent about is once you've decided you're going to look at something, then be public and make an announcement and say we're going to look at it, and that's how it's going to be. And we don't know what the answer is, but we're going to look at it. And then we did proceed to have a work session and look at it. So there may, in my view, that thing about the public not knowing, I think you may be able to put something in place that says the minute you make a decision to move forward, let the public know right then, so they have the same time for contemplation as council has. And so that may be something that can be put into place that creates that transparency. But if I'm wrong about anything behind the scenes, I just don't know of anything like that. To me, it was just like we do with every issue that we have. Somebody comes and talks to you about it, you listen, you think about it, and we don't ever talk, and then we have a council meeting to discuss it. So, anyway, next round, Mike, and then Betty.
Thank you, Mayor. I think you put that very well, and so did you, Chris. I was one of those that actually didn't know about that. No one had spoken about that particular one to me until we were talking about it at executive session. It was a surprise to me, which was unfortunate at the time. And I wish I had had more time to contemplate that and how we might contend with it. But I suppose in the intersection of what the two of you just said, really what you said, there's a motion I might make, but I would really want to have feedback from staff about any potential negative consequences for process that, would inhibit good ideas coming from the community. But I like the idea very much that if we talk about something like that in executive session, that there is serious interest that borders on negotiation, that we should say, hey, we're going to pursue and we're going to listen. We're going to officially listen and hear this proposal. And by the way, maybe we don't say this out loud, but that process is saying, by the way, if anybody else has got a better idea for this place, now's a good time for you to come tell us about it. So is there a negative from us having it be a duty of either council or manager to announce that we're officially listening on someone's idea?
Yeah, I'll try to respond maybe by example. The Northwest Community Credit Union, you need to think about how those usually come to us, and I've done a lot of these, and this is typically how it would happen is they're looking for a site. They're looking at a few sites. The courthouse property next to the courthouse was one of the sites, so they inquire with us about its availability. They start to talk maybe about what are some potential terms, what's the process for selling, and if they gauge some interest from us that, yeah, this is a surplus, not really formally surplus, but this is a development site in our opinion, they start developing a concept or cost estimates or just enough to figure out what they're willing to pay and so forth. And then we have to talk about terms. And this is before they've talked to their board of directors probably, so they probably don't want to come forward and start negotiating publicly unless till they get to a point where so there's some sensitivity about timing that I think is very important. And I think the other thing is when you do sometimes when we do sell property in a more formal process, there's a reason it's done by sealed bids that aren't open till 5 o'clock. It's because you don't want to disadvantage each other by so it's hard to negotiate in public, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So you kind of have to protect that to make it work.
Eddie, you're up.
Thank you. Well, there's a big difference between property that's been designated for development and property that's just public land. And I can see why if we say this property is going to be developed, you wouldn't have to announce every time someone says they're interested before you discuss who in public. But there's absolutely nothing wrong with everybody knowing if someone wants to buy a piece of public land at the very moment that it is known. And I think there shouldn't be anything secret about that, that the public should know instantly. It is not the same thing as something that was for sale. And Kesey Square is a very different thing from a place that's been designated to be developed and we're waiting to get offers. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. I totally agree with Councilor Taylor. Kesey Square, I mean, that's a public square, not surplus property by any stretch of the imagination. I just have a couple questions about the going back to the sale of the city parking lot to the shed. They're going to, the rationale we heard, they're going to expand their music school into that space. Is that still the plan? Because they were going to keep their parking lot across the street. Well, they've sold that to the Justina Group for the big grocery store coming in. So are they going to get rid of the parking lot and still expand the music school there?
I think when we talked to council about that transaction, I think they made it fairly clear that it was a longer term plan. They weren't doing it it wasn't imminent, that they had to come up with a concept and fundraise, and it was going to take them a while to fundraise. It's a pretty big undertaking. It's a big project. So I don't recall a time frame, but it was several years out before they envisioned. I think it's still their plan. They have a concept. I think we've seen a drawing of the music school. So I think that's still their plan, but it's not a next year kind of thing. They have to fundraise for it, and that's going to take a while.
Okay, thank you. Just out of curiosity, does the drawing you were shown, did that show any parking spaces? Or would it mean that they are not going to have any parking at all? And just depend on public parking?
I don't recall the parking, the number, if there's parking or not. It probably would not include a lot of parking, if any. Yeah.
Well, yeah, my concern with that was that there was no, I mean, I thought it was that was a significant chunk of land that was right across from the old City Hall. And we had no idea at that time what we were going to do with the City Hall. And I thought it was a mistake to get rid of it without, a long-term plan. I was in the minority, so it's a done deal. But the other thing that disturbed me about it was the lack of competitiveness. I mean, it's just like the shed came and saw an opportunity and came and made an offer, but nobody else knew that it was. We didn't know it was regarded as surplus property. We, the council, didn't know that. Council approved the sale, so it's a moot point. But it speaks to the larger issue of there was no, competitive. No RFP, no request for proposals, no. Somebody else may have said, "Hey, that's a great location. I'll give them an extra $100,000 or something." It's the businessman part of me that objects to sales like that. So I don't know what's going to come of this work session and some of the ideas, but I think that we do need to make a few changes, and I don't have any specific proposals right now. Thanks.
So I've got you in the queue, Greg. You're next. I just want to point out that we have, 3 minutes till time's up. So you may want to consider whether you want more time to think about this and have it brought back instead of trying to race to a conclusion at this point in the process. Just something for you to consider. Yes.
Actually, I was going to concur with that, Mayor. A couple of things, though, that I would like to see brought back in maybe another work session to continue this conversation. One is that if there is any quote-unquote model ordinances out there throughout the state where there provides a higher level of transparency for these transactions, where we can model something that may already be out there, may already be in place, that gives us a way to craft this that gives the public the transparency that I think Councilor Taylor is seeking in terms of this particular proposal that she has, and at the same time allowing for the process of the way people conduct business in these types of transactions to remain in a way that there is the level of confidentiality needed to proceed with these kinds of transactions, because not everybody wants everybody to know that their business in terms of, I'm looking at this particular property, whether it's a private to private transaction or a public to private transaction, for a variety of reasons. And I think that there is a need to know for the public to a certain degree and a certain level on these things. But by the same token, there's also the inherent gamesmanship in, negotiating these deals that may be removed if we have a process that, handcuffs the city in terms of making these kinds of negotiations, because there are private developers and other folks that are like, I may be looking at this. I may not want my competitors to know various things about my business. There's a lot of issues that are brought up by things of this nature, but I appreciate Councilor Taylor's effort at trying to, create a level of transparency in these negotiations that, currently may be, a flaw in our system. So I would welcome us extending this conversation to another work session, and with maybe having, some examples of best practices or best ordinances brought back to us.
So Betty, are you okay with us setting up a second work session with this before we put a motion out?
I still want that motion.
Today?
No, it doesn't have to be today.
Okay.
No, it was to bring back a motion, wasn't it?
It was to bring back a specific ordinance. So
No,
what you
no,
can
yes.
do is we can schedule basically a continuation of this work session, probably not till after the break. We can certainly look to see if there are any model ordinances or other ordinances. This one the council adopted just about 30 years ago, hasn't been tweaked really since then. So we can bring that information back. We've heard the concerns that you've raised about the current process. We can noodle about that and see if we can, in addition to...
Further thoughts about
And you
your
can keep
motion?
my motion.
And I still have your motion.
Excellent.
Everybody okay
Thanks,
with
guys.
that? Okay, we'll
That's
pick up.
great.
Yes, George.
Just one quick question. When you're doing this, Denny, you brought up something about gauging interest. So I guess I would need to get some kind of a determination at what point does gauging interest turn into negotiation? Because when you were talking about gauging interest, you did talk about prices and stuff. So I think it needs some clarity on that also.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I think we're set.
By the way, the ribbons that I passed out are solidarity ribbons with our colleagues in Orlando. One of my colleagues at work was passing these out as part of that
Thank you for bringing
that
it.
deal. Yeah.
There is no golf course or